She walked into my courtroom, clutching a tattered, leather-bound photo album, not for effect, not to manufacture pity, but because it was the only piece of the home she had spent a lifetime tending that she could physically bring with her. Her name was Martha Higgins, 81 years old, a widow who had lived alone for 2 decades in a Victorian-era house that had seen 3 generations grow up within its walls. She had been there since the neighborhood was dirt roads, long before the steel and glass towers of developers began swallowing the city's last scraps of green, and she had stayed. The house was paid off, a legacy built with the quiet, persistent industry of her late husband. Martha wasn't loud. She was the kind of woman you'd see on a porch on a Sunday afternoon, a quiet presence that lent stability to the entire block. Sitting across from her at the defendant's table was Julian Vane, 39 years old. His suit cost more than the average person's annual salary, and he wore it with the practiced ease of a man who has never been told no. He was the CEO of Vane Developments, a real estate mogul with a portfolio valued in the hundreds of millions, and he sat slumped in his chair with a bored, clinical indifference. He wasn't looking at Martha. He was scrolling through his phone, his thumb tapping rhythmically against the glass table, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if this courtroom were a minor scheduling conflict in a calendar dominated by high-stakes deals. He didn't see Martha Higgins. He saw an obstacle, a stubborn piece of property that was delaying the completion of his luxury high-rise, the horizon. I have sat on this bench long enough to recognize the distinct scent of arrogance. It smells like expensive cologne, and it radiated from every move Julian Vane made. He represented a new generation of investors, men who believe that everything in this world, including history, has a fixed price tag. I watched the room. There was a thick, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Martha Higgins wasn't the type to stand up and shout. She represented a generation of patience, of people who believe in fairness and the value of things that cannot be liquidated. But she was standing here today, not for the money, but for her dignity. I struck the gavel, slicing through my own internal monologue and the rhythmic clicking of Vane's phone screen. The gallery rose as one. Vane stood, but he did it begrudgingly, not even bothering to lock his phone before rising. I noted that. I note everything. I observed the way he exhaled a long, dramatic sigh of a man who believes he is the victim. I observed the way Martha braced herself, her knuckles white as she gripped her album. "Be seated," I said, my voice measured but sharp. "This is a civil matter concerning property dispute and damages. The plaintiff, Miss Martha Higgins, alleges that the defendant, Mr. Julian Vane, willfully destroyed a boundary fence and a century-old oak tree under shared ownership without consent or notification, resulting in both financial loss and profound emotional distress. Mr. Vane, do you understand the allegations against you?" Vane offered a smirk, the kind of lopsided, condescending expression a man wears when he believes he's the smartest person in the room. "I do, Your Honor. Though I must say, this entire proceeding is a gross misuse of the court's time over a trivial boundary disagreement that could have been resolved in 10 minutes. The 10 minutes comment drew a ripple of uneasy movement from the gallery. It was the laugh of a man who believed money granted him immunity from the law. I remained silent, letting that silence hang in the air, allowing the weight of his arrogance to settle on the room. I knew, with absolute certainty, that in that split second, Julian Vane believed he had already won. He was convinced that his bank account rendered him untouchable. He had no idea what was coming next. I turned my gaze to Martha's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Elias Grant, who had been sitting patiently while the defendant practically mocked the gravity of the proceedings. He rose, not with the fire of a seasoned litigator, but with the quiet resolve of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. He didn't start with legal statutes or property codes. He started with a single photograph. He placed an image on the evidence easel. It was black and white, faded at the edges, a photo of a young Martha holding the hand of a man in a military uniform, both of them standing beneath the sprawling canopy of the oak tree. The tree was already majestic, its limbs reaching out like the arms of an old guardian. "Your Honor," Elias began, his voice steady, "the defendant refers to this as a boundary disagreement. But for Miss Higgins, this tree is not a line on a survey map. It is the silent witness to 58 years of marriage, the shade for her children, and the anchor of the only home she has ever known." I looked over at Vane. He wasn't looking at the photo. He was adjusting his cufflinks, looking bored, his mouth curled into that slight, infuriating smile of a man who believes he's already won. It was the face of privilege, The kind that believes that if you have enough money, you can simply erase the past to make room for a more profitable future. Elias continued, moving to the next exhibit, a series of aerial photographs taken by a surveyor. They showed the construction site. It was a chaotic mess of heavy machinery, mud, and raw earth. He pointed to the location of the oak tree, then to the massive excavator that had been parked less than 6 feet from its trunk. The defendant's crew did not just happen to damage the tree, Your Honor. They systematically crippled it. They stripped away the protective root zone, compacted the soil until it was as hard as concrete, and severed the primary nutrient lines. This was not a side effect of progress. It was an act of reckless convenience. The room was silent. Even the court clerk had stopped typing. I looked down at the documents before me, then back at Vane. He was now leaning back in his chair, whispering something to his legal team, a dismissive comment. I had no doubt. He didn't care about the tree. He didn't care about the history. He saw the world in terms of square footage and profit margins, and to him, Martha Higgins was nothing more than a stubborn obstacle in the way of a development plan. I felt that familiar burn behind my eyes, that mixture of frustration and steely determination that only comes when you see a person with everything in the world trying to crush someone who has everything to lose. Vane thought he was playing a game of chess where he held all the pieces. He didn't realize that in this courtroom, the value of a piece isn't determined by its cost, but by its character. And Julian Vane, for all his millions, was about to find out exactly how much his character was worth. Mr. Vane, I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom like a razor. You seem to be under the distinct impression that your time is more valuable than the time of this court, and certainly more valuable than the history of a woman who has lived in that house since before you were born. Let me disabuse you of that notion immediately. In this room, you are not a CEO. You are a defendant. And if you interrupt this attorney again, you will be a defendant in contempt. Vane's smirk didn't vanish entirely, but it tightened. He glanced at his high-priced legal team, a flicker of irritation passing behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being scolded, and it showed in the way he stiffened his posture. Elias Grant, Martha's attorney, seized the moment. Your Honor, we have evidence that this wasn't merely a lapse in judgment, but a premeditated act of malice. He handed a document to the bailiff, who then passed it to me. It was an internal email chain from Vane Developments, dated 3 weeks before the incident. I read the text silently. It was from Julian Vane to his project foreman. It read, "The old woman is becoming a nuisance. She's quoting local statutes about the oak tree. I don't care about the tree, and I certainly don't care about her. If she's not out of the way by Monday, have the crew clear the site, tree included. I'll pay the fine if the city comes knocking. Just get it done." The courtroom went deathly still. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. I looked up from the paper, my gaze fixed squarely on Vane. He was staring at the ceiling, trying to look unimpressed, but his jaw was working, grinding back and forth. "Mr. Vane," I asked, my voice dangerously calm, "is this your signature at the bottom of this email?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his attorney, who was frantically whispering in his ear. I send hundreds of emails a day, Your Honor. I can't verify every." "Do not play coy with me," I snapped, leaning forward. "That is not a question about the volume of your correspondence. I am asking if that is your email, yes or no?" He let out a sharp, jagged sigh. "Yes, it's my email, but it was taken out of context. I was under immense pressure to meet a deadline for the investors." "Context," I repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "You are suggesting that there is a context in which it is acceptable to bulldoze a century-old tree and threaten the property of an elderly neighbor simply because it is inconvenient for your bottom line. You seem to believe that your financial deadlines grant you the authority to dictate the environment of those around you. You are mistaken." Martha sat quietly, her hands still resting on the faded photo album. She wasn't smiling, but for the first time, her shoulders seemed to drop an inch, as if the burden of fighting this giant alone was finally being shared. The evidence was no longer just about a tree, it was about character. And Julian Vane's character was rapidly unraveling in front of everyone. I gestured for Grant to proceed. The foundation of Vane's arrogance was starting to crack, and I wanted to see how much deeper the rot went. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom air, quiet but heavy with authority. "You seem to be under the impression that you can redefine reality simply by using the right business jargon. Let me be very clear. In this courtroom, site logistics does not grant you the right to act like a feudal lord trampling on the rights of your neighbors. You are the architect of this disaster, and you will not be allowed to point the finger at a subordinate to absolve yourself of your own arrogance." Vane's smirk didn't just vanish, it curdled. He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped, sensing that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. He leaned into the microphone, his knuckles white against the dark wood. "Your Honor, that email was private. It was between me and a project manager. We were under immense pressure to meet an investor deadline. The tree, it was an obstacle. We had the permits. If the execution was sloppy, that's a management issue, not a personal vendetta against the plaintiff." I took off my glasses, a gesture that signaled to everyone in the room that the pleasantries were officially concluded. I didn't say a word for several seconds. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating, ensuring that Vane felt the full weight of his own words. I wanted him to hear the silence. I wanted him to see the reflection of his own character in the stillness of the room. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice dangerously low, "let me tell you how the world actually functions. When you are the founder and CEO, and you issue a command, that command is the law within your kingdom. You directed that the site be cleared. You specifically acknowledged the existence of the woman next door, and you specifically expressed total, unadulterated disdain for her property rights. And then you gave the order. Now, you stand there in an expensive suit, trying to hide behind the very employees you pay to be your shield? That isn't just poor management, sir. That is cowardice." I saw Patricia Vane, his lead counsel, shift in her seat. She was a pro. She knew when a case had become a sinking ship. She wasn't looking at me, and she certainly wasn't looking at the gallery. She was focused intently on her notepad, likely calculating how much her retainer was worth compared to the impending damage to her professional reputation. She knew the tide had turned, and she was already looking for the high ground. I didn't mean," Vane stammered, his polished exterior finally showing a crack. His ego, the very thing that had fueled his success, was now his greatest liability. "You didn't mean what?" I cut him off, my eyes locked on his. "You didn't mean to destroy a century-old tree? You didn't mean to bully an 81-year-old widow? Or did you just not mean to get caught?" I turned my attention to the gallery. For the first time, I saw it the shift. His entourage, the junior associates, and the PR people who had arrived with him were no longer looking smug. They were staring at their shoes, avoiding eye contact. They saw the writing on the wall. Julian Vane had built his entire identity on being the smartest, most powerful man in the room, but he had forgotten the most basic principle of humanity. No matter how high you build your tower, if the foundation is built on the ruins of someone else's life, it will eventually collapse. And today, I was the one holding the wrecking ball. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice cutting through his stammering like a scalpel through thin ice. "You want to talk about sloppy management? You want to sit in my courtroom and cast blame on your subordinates for carrying out the very orders you gave in writing? I have the sworn affidavit from the project foreman, a man who has worked in this industry for 30 years, an honest man, which is clearly a concept you have no familiarity with." Vane's face, which had been a flushed, defensive pink only moments ago, drained of all color. He hadn't expected the foreman to flip. He hadn't expected the small people he stepped over to finally speak up. He sat there, his mouth slightly agape, the CEO facade completely dismantled. "The foreman," I continued, reading from the document with a calm, deliberate rhythm, stated clearly that when he voiced concerns about the proximity to the oak tree and the risk of damage, your response was not a technical correction, but a threat to his livelihood. You told him, and I quote, "If you value your position at this firm, you will stop playing the environmentalist and take the tree down before the end of the day." I let the document fall onto the desk. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the final nail in his coffin. That isn't management, Mr. Vane. That is intimidation. That is the behavior of a man who believes that his wealth gives him a divine right to reshape the world to his liking, regardless of the law, regardless of his neighbors, and regardless of the damage he leaves in his wake. Vane shifted, his eyes darting toward his legal team, as if they could conjure a miracle, but they were as silent as the grave. They knew the line had been crossed. There was no context in the world that could explain away a direct threat aimed at destroying property that wasn't his. I looked over at Martha. She was no longer looking down at her album. She was looking at him. For the first time all day, she wasn't looking at him with fear or fatigue. She was looking at him with a clarity that only comes when you realize the person who has been bullying you is actually quite small. The power dynamic in the room had shifted fundamentally. He was the one holding the expensive suit, the one with the offshore accounts and the high-rise dreams. But in the harsh light of this courtroom, he looked exactly like what he was, a bully who had finally run into someone who refused to be intimidated. "I'd like to remind you, Mr. Vane," I said, my eyes boring into him, "that while you may be the architect of your own little kingdom outside these walls, in here, you are merely a witness who has been caught in a blatant lie. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Or should we just move on to the damages portion of this hearing and see how much you're willing to pay to pretend this never happened?" Vane opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked like he had been slapped. The arrogance was still there, but it was being replaced by the raw, jagged edge of panic. He realized that this wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about his pride, and he was about to lose that too. "Let's talk about the obstacle, as you so callously referred to it in your own correspondence," I said, flipping to the arborist's report. This wasn't just a random plant in the dirt. This tree, a Quercus robur, was over 120 years old. It survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the expansion of this city. It provided a canopy that regulated the temperature for that entire side of the block, preventing soil erosion, and, more importantly, it was the focal point of the plaintiff's property for nearly 6 decades. Vane scoffed, a quick, nervous sound. "It's a tree, Your Honor. I offered to replace it with 20 saplings. That's more than fair market value." The air in the room didn't just chill, it turned icy. I pulled my glasses down and stared at him. "Fair market value? Mr. Vane, you have the emotional intelligence of a calculator. You cannot replace a century of growth with 20 sticks in the ground. You cannot replace the history, the shade, or the quiet companionship that a living organism of that age provides. Do you honestly think that if I cut down your front door, I can make it fair by leaving you 20 pieces of raw lumber in your driveway?" Vane opened his mouth, then shut it, his face reddening. He looked at his lawyers, seeking help, but they remained still. They knew better than to interrupt me when I was in this mode. "This court isn't just a place for bean counting, Mr. Vane," I continued, my voice gaining volume, echoing off the high ceilings. "This is a place where we balance the scales, and your scales are completely out of whack. You think you can purchase your way out of common decency? You think because you have a budget, the law bends to your whim?" Elias Grant stepped in, sensing the opening. "Your Honor, we are asking not only for the replacement value of the tree, which the expert has calculated at an unprecedented figure due to its maturity, but also for punitive damages. Mr. Vane's own emails demonstrate a malicious intent to disregard local ordinances and the property rights of an elderly woman who could not fight him on equal financial footing. He didn't just make a mistake, he made a choice." Vane finally looked rattled. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore. He was looking at the judge's bench, looking for a way out. He began to sweat, the fabric of his expensive jacket straining slightly across his shoulders. The company has procedures, Your Honor. I wasn't personally on the ground. I trusted my team to handle the compliance." "Oh, save it," I barked. "You trusted your team to clear the path. You gave the order. And now that you're sitting in the hot seat, suddenly you're just a busy executive who knew nothing about the dirt and the roots? You aren't that stupid, Mr. Vane. And I'm certainly not that gullible. You knew exactly what you were doing. You thought Martha Higgins would be too tired, too old, or too intimidated to challenge you. You thought you could just push her aside like she didn't matter. Well, you pushed against the wrong person, at the wrong time, in the wrong courtroom." Martha sat straight in her chair. The weariness seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet, fierce sense of validation. She didn't look at Vane with hate. She looked at him with the pity one reserves for a spoiled child. And that, I suspect, hurt him more than any fine I could levy. "I have heard enough," I said, the gavel thudding against the wood, a sound that seemed to snap the tension in the courtroom like a taut wire. Vane looked up, his face ashen. He had been calculating the cost of the settlement, clearly hoping that a check, no matter how large, would make this whole situation vanish into the ether of his legal team's filings. He didn't understand. This was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. "Mr. Vane," I began, my voice steady and cold, "you came into this courtroom with the arrogance of a man who believes that every single thing in this world has a price tag that you can afford. You thought you could bulldoze your way through local ordinances, through the history of this city, and, most cruelly, through the life of a woman whose only crime was standing in the path of your profit margin. You were wrong." I motioned to the file on my desk. "The horticultural assessment is irrefutable. You didn't just remove a tree. You destroyed a century of growth, of ecosystem, and of Martha Higgins' peace of mind. And let the record show, the email you sent to your foreman proves that this was done with full knowledge, malice, and a complete disregard for the law. I leaned forward, looking directly into his eyes. You asked me for fair market value earlier. Well, let me give you the value of what you took. You cannot put a price on the shade that tree provided or the memories that grew alongside it. But the court can put a price on the arrogance you displayed while trying to take it. I laid out the ruling with the precision of a surgeon. The damages were not just the replacement cost, which was exorbitant for a specimen of that maturity, but also significant punitive damages for the intentional, malicious nature of his conduct. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a figure that would make even his accountants wince. I am awarding the full amount requested by the plaintiff, plus the maximum allowed punitive damages under the statute for intentional property destruction, I declared. And I am ordering you to pay for the full cleanup and restoration of the area, to be supervised by an independent arborist, not your own people. You will provide Miss Higgins with a letter of formal apology to be read into the public record. Vane tried to speak a pathetic, stuttering attempt to bargain, but I cut him off with a look that silenced the entire gallery. This is not a debate, sir. You are not at a board meeting. You are in a court of law. And if you so much as think about dragging this poor woman through another appeal, I will personally ensure that the press knows exactly how you treat your neighbors and how you respect the law. The color had completely drained from his face now. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had finally met someone he couldn't buy, intimidate, or ignore. Martha didn't cheer, and she didn't gloat. She simply closed her album, her expression one of profound relief. The giant had been cut down to size, not by a lawyer, but by the weight of his own misdeeds. I took off my glasses, the silence in the courtroom deepening until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every soul present. I looked from the plaintiff, who was quietly wiping a stray tear from her cheek, to the defendant, who was now staring at the table as if looking for an exit that didn't exist. Mr. Vane, I said, my voice echoing off the walls, you are to pay the sum of $400,000. This includes the full replacement value of the tree, the cost of property restoration supervised by an independent arborist, and punitive damages to be paid directly to Miss Higgins for your intentional, malicious disregard of her property rights. Furthermore, you will issue a formal, written apology to be filed with this court and published in the local newspaper, the same one that carried your advertisements for this development project. Vane tried to protest, his voice barely a whisper. Your Honor, the punitive damages, that's excessive. That's a career-ending amount. That, I snapped, slamming my gavel down with a force that made him jump, is the cost of character. Mr. Vane, it is the price you pay for believing you were above the law. If it ends your career, then perhaps your career was built on a foundation that was never meant to last. We are adjourned. As I stood and walked toward my chambers, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, the murmur of the gallery, and the soft, steady rhythm of Martha Higgins' cane as she finally walked toward the exit, not with the hesitation of an old woman, but with the steady pace of someone who had walked through fire and come out whole on the other side. I sat in my chambers for a long time afterward, the weight of the day settling into my bones. People often ask me why I do this, why I spend my days listening to the grievances of people who have often lost their way. It's because of days like today. It's because power, when left unchecked, has a tendency to turn ugly, to turn cruel. It turns into a shield for the powerful and a bludgeon against the weak. And my job, the only job that matters in that room, is to take that shield away. This wasn't just about a tree. It was never about a tree. It was about the fundamental truth that at the end of the day, no matter how high you build your towers or how much you inflate your net worth, the only thing that truly survives is your integrity. Martha Higgins built a life of beauty and quiet strength for nearly 6 decades. Julian Vane spent his life building an empire of vanity. Today, the law acknowledged what the neighborhood already knew, that beauty and character matter, especially when they are threatened by greed. I picked up my pen, ready for the next file, the next dispute, the next morning. But I lingered on the notes I had made about Martha. I hope in my own way I gave her what she came here for, not just the money, but the acknowledgement that what she built, what she loved, and what she stood for had a place in this world that no amount of money could destroy. The gavel has fallen, the record is permanent, and the truth for once was louder than the bank account.